So picture the scene, right? Let's imagine, for example, that you just watched my video on 3 great reasons to learn a foreign language. Link in the description below if you haven't already seen it, check it out at the end. And let's imagine you decided, yeah, I want to do this, I want to learn a new language, but pick up a new skill. But then the doubt starts to creep in. You see, there's so many thousands of languages out there, how can I possibly decide which one I want to learn? And that's where this video comes in. You see, it's easier than you might think to whittle down your choices to just a couple, just by figuring a couple of things out first. Let's take a look at what those are. If you're new around here, my name's Connor. I've been making videos about language and culture since, well, actually only since last week as it happens. And today we're going to be looking at how to decide which language you actually want to learn. Step number 1 is to set yourself a goal. You want to work out why it is that you want to learn a language. For ideas, you can check out my last video, link in the description below. And you want a rough idea of how good you actually need to get at the language to achieve that goal. Maybe you regularly go on holiday to Spanish-speaking countries and you want to converse with the locals. That's great, that's your answer, off you go. Or maybe you want to become proficient enough in a language that you can use it in your career. If that's the case, then you'll want to work out which languages are particularly in demand in the industries where you are. The British Council lists these 10 languages as the most important languages for the UK's future prosperity and global standing. So maybe picking one of those would be a good place to start. But before you go ahead and think, okay, I'm going to pick Arabic because it's a really sought after language, just hold on there for a moment, okay? There's a couple more things we need to look at first. Now, clearly some languages are harder to learn than others, and how much harder is going to depend on a few different things. For example, if you speak English, then you can have a pretty good go at reading French words, even if you don't exactly know how to pronounce them or what they mean, and there are some striking similarities between them. The word information, for example, information, may be pronounced differently in the two languages, but it's spelled exactly the same in both. If we add in Portuguese, Spanish, and Italian to the equation, then you can have a pretty good idea of what these words mean, even if you're not familiar with those languages. Now let's compare that with the Icelandic word for information, which I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce, and the Arabic word, where you actually need to work out what the letters are before you can even attempt to read the word. Languages belong to different groups, or different families, and they share different characteristics and different heritage. English, for example, is a Germanic language. It has a lot of Latin influence in there as well, whereas languages like French, Portuguese, Spanish, Italian, they're known as Romance languages because they have Latin as their main root, hence the various similarities between them. And clearly choosing a language which has a lot in common with your own native language, which maybe shares the same family or a similar family, is going to give you a big head start over choosing a language which has absolutely nothing in common with your own and comes from a completely different family. Now, that's not to say that you shouldn't choose a language which is completely different from your own just because it's going to be harder. It's just something worth bearing in mind. If you're planning on using it for your career, then you're going to have to be very diligent to make sure that you put the time in, put the effort in to make sure you get the hang of it. Whereas if it's just going to be a hobby or a casual interest, then you can go for it. There's nothing stopping you. Something else you'll want to consider is the different cultural elements that you want to get stuck into when you get to grips with the language. Maybe you're into Japanese anime, for example, and you want to watch it without relying on the subtitles, or maybe you've got a passion for Danish crime dramas. Maybe you don't know yet. The point is, if you've got your eye on a language, then take a look at the cultures of countries where that language is spoken and see if anything sparks your interest. You may also find a resource or a tool that turns out to be very useful for you when it actually comes to learning that language. Google is your friend, but broadly speaking. It's a gateway to the world's knowledge and information, and it's become such an integral part of our lives that we actually invented a verb for it. That means that there's an enormous amount of language-related resources available at your fingertips. However, Google can't just randomly summon these materials into existence. They have to exist in the first place. Someone has to invent them, or write them, and upload them to the internet, where we mere mortals can access them. That means that if you're choosing a more obscure language to learn, then you might have a harder time finding resources that you can actually use in those early stages. So just do a little bit of research before you get started to see what kind of resources would be available to you in that language on the internet. I mean, just here on YouTube alone, you're going to find so many resources relating to French and German, commonly learned languages, but you might find that your options are a bit more limited if you want to learn the language of the Jadoon. Let's imagine now that you've picked your language, you've jumped right into it, but things just aren't looking as rosy as you thought they might when you started out. For whatever reason, things just aren't really clicking in those early stages. The key thing is, well, not to give up straight away, but also not to be afraid to abandon your current language and choose a new one. Of course, you should give yourself enough of a chance to see if you can work through those early challenges and get to grips with that language, but before you feel like you should abandon the whole project of learning a language completely, just consider whether you need to pick a different language, maybe an easier one that's got more in common with your own native language perhaps. The early stages of learning a language can often be the most difficult stages, especially if you've never learnt a language before, and you're effectively learning how to learn a foreign language. But we talked about some of the benefits of learning a new language in my last video, link in the description if you haven't seen it, and I genuinely believe they're worth pursuing. So, don't give up entirely, but don't be afraid of a change of plan either. This video is part 2 of a little mini-series that I'm doing on this channel about getting people into language learning. Part 1 was about the benefits, about why you should learn a new language. In this part we discussed how you can actually decide which language you want to learn, and in the final part, part 3, we're going to look at how to actually start learning a language even if you have no language learning experience whatsoever. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see more like it, including part 3 of this series about how to learn a new language, then hover over that subscribe button, give it a click, and maybe even drop me one of these if you're feeling particularly generous. And I look forward to seeing you again in another video very soon. Goodbye.